Hi, my name is Mirko Presser. I'm from the Alexandra Institute, the head of research and innovation for the Smart City Lab. And today I'll be talking to you about big data and why you should care about it. 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are generated every day, so that about 90% of all data ever generated in the world was generated in the last 2 years alone. And it's data coming from different sources. It's more and more coming from sensors that measure information. It's people shooting videos like we do just now in high definition. It's taking pictures. It's working with different mobile phones or taking records of transactions for financial transactions, for instance. And it is actually a lot of data if you sum it all up. Individually, you can have big data sources, but if you sum it all up, it becomes very, very large. But big is relative. So how do we actually scope big in this term? And I choose 3 sort of definitions for big here in relation to hardware, so memory, for instance. Big as in too big for memory. I can't fit the size of the data into the memory of the computing machine that I'm using. So it overwhelms the hardware, and I need to start using software tricks, or I need to buy better hardware. Also, if I look at the big data, I need to do something. I need to interact with it somehow. I need to visualize it and turn the model or so. I need to change and manipulate it. Then even small data comes very, very big very quickly, depending on what I want to do with it. But it's also a computation problem. So you can solve it with better hardware or using software tricks. But what I'm really interested in terms of big data is too big or too complex to comprehend. So this is data that I look at, and I don't even know exactly what I'm looking at yet. I have a fundamental understanding of what I've measured, but if I start combining it with other data sources, I might find it very difficult to analyze it in terms of a new business model or understanding what it actually means. It's also maybe too big for only one organization or one group of people to look at. Maybe you need to share it amongst many people to get an understanding. And maybe it's even a degree of luck to find out what it means. And this is exactly what I'm going to talk about. It's this last part, too complex to comprehend. So it might not be the traditional view of a big data set, which is very, very big, petabytes or so, but data sets that are a little bit funny. So the first one that I want to talk about is an example from Eric Fisher's Photostream. These are this is data mined from Flickr, this social media photo sharing website. But it's not the photos he's interested in. It's the metadata between or behind the pictures. It's the location of the picture and the person who took it. And he categorizes these pictures by plotting them onto a map, the geodata of the different photos, plotting it on a map, and giving it a color. Red in this image here are the tourists, and blue are the locals. And then he has certain rules. If the pictures are taken within 10 minutes of each other, he connects them with a line. And he draws these beautiful maps. It's art. He calls himself an artist, a photographer. But he does something useful, because suddenly somebody sees these pictures and says, well, I'm not going to hang this on my wall. I can actually make a business out of it. So Barcelona Digital, the organization behind the smart city of Barcelona, looked at it and said, well, now I can identify the areas where there's tourists. So I know which areas I have to clean up, so they take the most beautiful pictures and take them home and show how beautiful our city is. Similarly, there's big companies now experimenting with their data that they're having. So this is an image of Spain showing different transactions based on sort of categories. The categories are groceries, gas stations, and so on. And it's actually a movie, and you can watch it on YouTube. You can quite easily find it if you look for Smart City and BBVA, the bank. You will see this timeline of transactions popping up of one time and disappearing over the other time. So you're moving from the day where there's mainly sort of groceries to the evening where there's mainly restaurants and bars. You can see that in the morning people fill up their car with gas. And although it's a beautiful visualization, the person behind it, Marcelo, says, this is not something I want to hang up on my wall or show for reasons of looking beautiful. I want to use this to think about what I can do with my data. It's my initial step to be inspired, to know, to understand what this data is about, because it's too big a set to just look at in terms of numbers. You need to visualize it. You need to look at it. So now we talked about social media data a little bit through this Flickr example of tourists and locals. We had financial transactions in terms of data, but there's a new set of data coming up that is participatory data on one side. So you have people with mobile phones offering up their services in terms of providing geolocation, maybe even some user input that they're sharing about here's an event or here's an accident. There's more and more of these applications coming up for your mobile phone, for instance. But there's also another drive, which is the Internet of Things. It's people and organizations deploying sensors on a massive scale. And this image here is actually from Santander in Spain. It's a project that we're involved in. It's the Smart Santander project, where we're deploying 20,000 sensors in the city to measure different things. Anything from car parking to environmental data, to transportation data, to data about the water quality and so on. And we're collecting all this data in one platform, and we're offering it up to the citizens in terms of services, but also in terms of raw data. So now we can start imagining a model of everything, at least in the city. It's sort of confined. You can collect the data, you can manage it, and you can find the people that actually are the gatekeepers to this data. So you can look at all of these different categories, like schools, elections, events, culture, cooling, police, activities, and sectors. And traditionally, you had seen them as silos stacked alongside each other, each one having a budget, each one having an IT system, and each one being separate to each other. But now we can start thinking of them as platforms. So we're moving from this silo thinking towards a platform thinking, where we're opening up the channels for the data to flow freely and create this big data thinking. The ability to look at the data as a whole, not as individual stacks. And then it becomes big, and it becomes complex to look at. So one way to organize it is just to do that. You organize it back into these silos. So this is an example of a dashboard for citizens, for instance, where you have, on one side, you have maybe some statistical data, you have images, you have your Twitter and your RSS feeds. But you also have environmental data or transportation data. You can also organize it in terms of maps, so it's like location-based data. But it's still sort of stacking it into silos and looking at it in isolation. But it's at least a start towards saying, okay, I integrate the data as one view. So instead of just organizing the data, we can also move from just looking at it in compartments in these silos into, again, a more integrated view and looking at prediction models. So we're using the data to actually build a model where we can extrapolate into the future, where we can run different what-if scenarios. So in this project, the UrbGrade project, which we have running in Kalundborg, but also in Barcelona and Eibar in Spain, we're looking at different sort of scenarios, again, a little bit towards the sector, but looking across the sectors as well, where we can say, what if we have an increase in population, or what if the demographic changes, or what if something else happens in the city? How does the infrastructure need to adapt to it? So we can use data to actually look at urban planning, what we can do with it. So now we heard a lot about the different types of data and how we can use it and organize it to understand it better, to work with it. But how will this affect us? And if we look at the sort of three categories of public authorities, like for instance government or city authorities, people or enterprises, then we can see different ways of how they can benefit from it and how it affects them. So for instance, the relationship between the public authorities and people, there's a clear relationship of transparency. So if we have all this data being offered to the public in terms of, for instance, open data, which is sort of a close relation to the big data side of things, then we can have a better overview of what is happening. We can monitor, we can analyze, we can see it in more transparent ways. It's not so much about words and politics, it's more about understanding and analysis. So there's a very strong degree of transparency, and this also comes with accountability, for instance, for the political side of things, but also with an understanding and a maturity from the public perspective. Between the people and the enterprise, of course, there's a much higher degree of business models or available business models there. New innovations can bring new services that can provide an added value to the people, to the citizens. And then between enterprises and the public authorities, you have a very high degree of the possibility of optimization. So you have a strong drive, for instance, in the public authorities to reduce costs, to save money. Pretty much every city in Europe is broke, apart from Luxembourg, more or less. So there's a very strong drive on saving money at the authority level. So usually this is cutting either costs in terms of administration, but it also is trying to save money in the services that you're offering to the citizens, but without losing the service level that you have now. So when we look at, for instance, schools and education, you don't want to lower that. It's difficult to solve it with big data. But if we start looking at, for instance, the utility services such as water, transportation, waste, and electricity, there's actually a lot to be had in terms of big data analysis and understanding where there's wasteful use or where we can optimize the systems. So, will all this data make us economists? Will we now look at every single thing and analyze everything meticulously? We have now all this information available to us. I don't think so. It's not in our blood that we become economists, that we now start thinking like an economist. But we might have to lean towards trusting the machine a little bit more. We're already trusting our mobile phones and GPS systems so immensely that some people drive off a bridge. So maybe we start trusting some other devices a little bit more again. So we have services come out now by companies like Google that offer us Google Now. So what's happening now around me? Do I trust that, or how do I deal with it? So you can think of this magic 8-ball that you shake and say, should I buy this cucumber in the supermarket? And this device will come back and say no, because you haven't eaten your cucumbers last week. Or you make maybe more difficult decisions from a political perspective or from a city planning perspective. Should I make this a mixed commercial residential area, or should I make it an industrial area? Of course, we already have planning tools for this, but we will add on top of these planning tools with all this data that is coming out, and it will help us become a more, on one side, maybe efficient society, but I think also a more responsible society to some degree. So, in conclusions, I think that all of us should embrace and investigate what data we have. Even as private individuals, we have massive amount of data usually stored on our computers. Sometimes we lose it and we feel it's very sad event, it's a loss to us. But we still don't understand because it's so digital. If I lose something physical, I have an understanding of it. But if it's digital, it's kind of very strange to lose it. So we still need to investigate that. But even not just as individuals, as private persons, but as organizations as well. Large corporations are very used to this kind of dealing with this. They have other problems looking at it. But public authorities are now starting to learn with all the data that they have and where it is actually stored, because they're very distributed as entities. The second part that I would like to recommend is that you visualize your data. If you just look at it from a data set perspective, it's sometimes very difficult to understand it. It's, you have your key performance indicators that you measure and you use your data for it. But can you use it in another way? Maybe it might be useful if it is location-based data to plot it on a map, if it's timestamp data to have a timeline, or any other way that you can think of combining or organizing your data to visualize it, to maybe get a better understanding. And the last part is actually to share it and collaborate. Because if you show your data set to somebody else, he might have a completely different understanding than you have about this specific data set. He might also say, well, if you combine two things together, maybe you get something very interesting out of it. So embrace, visualize, and share. I think these are the three mantras that we should take out of it. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to M-Talks for letting me speak here. Thank you.